Hello, everybody. Today I thought I'd talk about the pandemic, and well, it's pretty much the anniversary. It's March 19th, 2024. And I wanted to talk about my experience, how I kind of lived through it, and just like looking back at it now, right? Like it's kind of interesting to see how people have acquired some abilities, like as working from home, for example, video conferencing through Zoom, through Google Meet. Like basically everybody nowadays knows how to do that. And, before the pandemic, nobody could do that. Um, and just basically like talk about where I was, what I went through, because I think that's something that I haven't touched upon these videos. And I mean, I wouldn't say it was a historic moment, but it was a moment that was pretty significant, right? Because basically, um, if you had any doubt as to how the world works, that was basically something that happened in the world, so it affected everybody, right? Now, I'm not going to get into it affected us negatively or positively. I'm just going to try to be objective and just tell you my experience and what I saw, right? Um, well, all of this comes at a time where um, we have again, yet again, another talk of World War III just around the corner, which I've already said in my videos, I don't think is going to happen. But if it did happen, it would be interesting to kind of consider the pandemic and maybe even think about what we did during the pandemic, like our habits, if we were to do those again, right? Um, I know if like all of a sudden a nuclear war broke out, there would probably have to be evacuations. But I'm guessing a lot of people would probably just stay home. Like the countries that weren't involved would probably just stay in their homes, right? Like they would probably go on lockdown or something like that. But again, I don't think it's going to happen. I also wanted to say how I was reading comments on all these memes on Twitter on how they're talking about World War III, and some person was like, it's already happening, right? Because the war is more of a bio war, and I kind of agree with this person. I was like, this person said, the war is going down, or the war is basically happening with disease, via disease, like I guess like countries throwing diseases at each other, or through natural disasters. But those natural disasters are actually fabricated. So I thought the person said something else, but I don't remember. But yeah, I thought those those points were kind of interesting. But yeah, now back to the pandemic. Like I was just saying, the pandemic taught everybody how to work from home, because basically nowadays, they say you need to monetize your hobby. Like find what you want to do, and do it for money, right? So if you really like to do this, do it for money, and then you won't have to live, and then you won't have to work a day in your life. And I kind of find that to be a little bit misleading, because you still have to work. So it's not like you're getting off free from working. That is, you still have to be a slave of the system in order to participate in the system, as part of society. So I think it's just a very nice way of saying, get working, right? Like find your hobby and do it. Like whatever you like to do, do it. You're free to choose, but nonetheless, you still have to work, right? So it's kind of like, okay. Um, all right, so it's 4 years since the pandemic started. And yeah, remember when nobody would do, okay. So what, okay, so to get into my experience, and ironically, like there's something going around the city that I'm at. I don't know if you could tell, like I'm kind of like congested from my nose, and I've been having like a runny nose. I think it's hay fever or spring allergies, because I haven't gotten like sick with a cold or anything like that. Um, but okay, What I wanted to say is that I remember back in probably the pandemic started happening in 2019, at the end of 2019, right? December. So I remember that, the news broke out like probably late December, early January. I was living with my dad, and I remember just hearing about it. But for me, it was kind of like, like you hear about Ukraine, you hear about Hamas or Israel or whatever, and you're just kind of like, okay, whatever, you know. And I remember that's kind of how I heard about it. It was like China, Wuhan, bat soup, pandemic, right, or virus, right, and then so then the next thing I started hearing was how the virus was traveling, right? Like how it was now in Europe, how it was getting into the United States, And I'm in Mexico, so for me it was kind of like is it gonna end up coming over here? Like what's gonna happen? And I remember the very slow response of leaders, right? World leaders, just leaders in general, like nobody knew what to do. Nobody was doing anything. I think for me that was the most upsetting thing from the pandemic. I think the pandemic brought out a lot of like negative emotions, but those negative emotions were more like during the lockdown. But I think like the one that could really uh, you know be an emotion um, that wouldn't really have a justification was the slow response of the governments in the beginning, right? Of leaders, just leaders in general, community leaders, um, business leaders, like these type of people that are in charge of deciding whether or not they should shut down their business, right? And again, maybe it was all for the money, but that's pretty stupid. That's upsetting. So I remember it was like around February 2020, and then all of a sudden, um, I start hearing reports that the virus has hit Mexico. Um, so it was like February, and I was still going to work, right? And people were recommending, government authorities were basically recommending people to just no, they weren't recommending face masks back then. Still, like in February, March, um, I remember if you had a mask, it meant you were sick, and people would kind of like say like, "Oh, we got to stay away from this person." As of March, it hit our city, and in my city, when the first cases started being reported, nobody really did anything. Like things just kind of kept going. Um, and I remember it was around this time because it was almost like spring break, and I remember like around this time, like mid March, we were kind of feeling like, oh man, like we need a break. Um, so there was talk about lockdown, about going home, about just shutting everything off, and yeah, it must have been like mid March, and I had two jobs. Excuse me. So both of these jobs, you know, light as a breeze. They were still having people, in their school. So it was like, all right, whatever. And then it was probably like around this time exactly, like March 18th, 19th, or something like that. And that's when we got sent home. Like that's when people were like, okay, we need to go home. I remember like probably for like 3 days, the last 3 days, I was wearing a mask, but I wasn't wearing a mask because I thought I was sick or something like that. I was wearing a mask because I didn't want to get sick from other people, right? So then, yeah, it was like around March 19th, something like that. And one of my jobs sent us all home. The other job didn't. And I remember it was like a Monday. It must have been like March 20th, 21st, 22nd, something like that. And they were like, yeah, everybody's gonna, come to work, whatever. And they shut that place down. The government shut that place down because they were still like, no, like, we're still working, we're having people here, whatever. And the government was like, no, like, we told you, like, shut down the businesses, right? And again, that's kind of like the most frustrating thing. Like, you have a global pandemic where I have to say personally, I think I got it once. I wasn't sure. I lost my sense of smell for like a couple months, and I don't remember getting sick. I got sick when I got the shot, right? Like the vaccine. That's when I got sick. The second I got two vaccines, but I think the second one is when I got really sick. Um, but it was because of the vaccine. I was sick for like 2 or 3 days, but like dead sick. Like I couldn't even get out of bed. Like I was, it was horrible. That's probably the sickest I've ever been in my life. But during the whole like pandemic time, I wasn't really sick. If I got sick, it was probably like an occasional flu or something like that. Um, so yeah, I remember, the businesses closed down like officially, like shut down, and that must have been like late March. Late March, nobody really knew what to do. Everybody was like, "What?" Uh, and then I think it was like you just started communicating with people like through social media, through your cell phone. Like I remember we had like a week or two where we didn't work, but we still had to get paid because this is the first time this has ever happened. Um, but we were having meetings. People were learning like how are we going to do this. Okay, Zoom, Google Meet, those were the places where people were going. um, and I learned how to use. I gotta say personally, I like Zoom more than Google Meet or Microsoft Teams or these other ones that I think they're a little bit more difficult. They're less. Well, I'm like a Zoom guy, right? So we started using Zoom, paid for the version. I think the stocks in Zoom like skyrocketed because everybody was using these video conferencing programs, and like 2 weeks into the pandemic, we started working, but via online, right? Like working from home, which for me was awesome, right? Because I was at home chilling. I remember the supermarkets. I remember being like scared that they were going to close down the supermarkets and then we weren't going to have food or we weren't going to be able to buy food. So I would try to stack up on like tuna or like canned goods. And then I had to make everything from home because at that time I was working like all day. So I was I was actually buying my food from like restaurants and stuff. Um, and during that time I had to make my own food. So I would buy like hot dogs, hot dog sausages, hot dog buns, like meat and kind of cook it, tuna, and I would kind of vary that throughout the week. Um, and at that time, like I mentioned, I was living with my dad, and there was a point where things kind of got heated between me and him. But I think it was just because of the pressure that we were together, like just by ourselves, like the whole time, right? Like a lot of people say, yes, we need human connection, we need social connection, social contact, even if it's just like that, hello, good morning at work or whatever, or just getting out of the house. But back in April 2020, like literally no one was out, right? Like I'm sure you remember those videos where like the streets were like empty, right? Like anywhere in the world, basically, like they were empty, right? That like tourist attractions, like in Paris, just empty, right? Streets that were normally filled with people, empty, right? Like everyone was at home. I, I remember I wanted to drink beer and I would drink beer like on the weekends, and then they stopped making beer, right? So we couldn't even get beer. We couldn't even get like alcohol. I don't remember if we could get alcohol, but we couldn't get beer. They eventually came out with like with like this 1% or 2% alcoholic beer, but it didn't do anything. You couldn't really like get a buzz from it or anything. But yeah, like that was basically, my life. I was working from home. I started to learn how to use Zoom, how to basically do my job from home, which I think is kind of cool because nowadays you see anything if there's ever like a problem or anything, there's really no excuse for you to say, oh, I can't go to the office, I can't come in or whatever. Like, just video conference it, right? Like everything is kind of like more flexible in that sense. um, During that time, I wanted to get into my master's as well. So I remember the pandemic was supposed to be like as soon as we went into lockdown, and everybody was officially in lockdown as of April 2020, right? And then I think it was like people were like, when is this gonna be over, right? And people would be like, yeah, probably in May, June. I remember people were very optimistic. They would say, yeah, probably like next month or in June. And then like May, June came around, and then people were like, no, we'll probably be over like August, September, you know? And I remember like for me officially the pandemic was about 3 months, like full lockdown, everything, nothing open, except the supermarkets. You had to go in the supermarket with a face mask, with this like shield thing, with gloves, and I think that was it. Yeah, like they were recommending gloves. Some people wore them, some people didn't. But you weren't allowed to go in if you didn't have like the face mask and the I forget what this thing is called, but like a plastic thing over the face mask for your like your eyes, or I don't even know. And everywhere you went, it was like you had to wait in line, because it was like only 10 people allowed here, only 5 people allowed here, only 2 at a time, whatever. Um, yeah, and then when you got home, you had to wipe everything down, right? Because you didn't know if it was contaminated. You had to do the shoe thing, where you had to put the shoes like um, near the door. You had to change your clothes, leave your clothes like by the door, right? Or wash them or whatever. Like everybody was kind of paranoid. But then again, you think, well, we didn't really have much to do. We were just all at home. I'm sure many people. I mean, I gotta say it was kind of a breather comparing it to, like the intense work that we were doing up till 2019 and early 2020, and then it was just like we get like a break, right? But then everybody started getting stressed because you couldn't go out, because you couldn't socialize, because you couldn't be with friends and whatever. And I understand that part. Um, but at the same time, there was a benefit, which is like you got to rest and you got to just be home and do your own thing. I didn't really take advantage of it. I could have done more things maybe, but I didn't really do much. I just worked, played video games, and just kind of hung out at home. And then, I gotta say, like around September 2020 is when some stores, some places started to like, well, I think the supermarkets were always open, but like other places started to kind of like reopen, with like very limiting um, conditions, right? Like the same type of conditions that the supermarkets had, like 5 people, 10 people max at a time. These new places like schools, like well, not schools officially, but like services, right? Like for information, like I mentioned, I wanted to do my master's in this school. The sales department was open physically, and I was able to get the information physically from them. But the classes, everything was online, right? Like everything was like online, go online. Like we're doing everything online, via messaging, whatever. And then gradually from like September, very slowly, they started to allow more people in. I think there was this thing here in Mexico where it was like the green, the yellow, and the red light. So it was like red light was like full warning, and then yellow light was like a little bit more freer and more flexible, and then green light was like, you can basically go back to the way things were. And everybody was talking about this new normal back then. um, I don't know if now we're living in the new normal. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, like World War III, or if there were to be another pandemic, I honestly think we wouldn't take it as seriously as we took this one in 2020. Um, I think there would be people that would just be like, no, like that's just stupid. Um, I know a lot of people died from it. I personally, I didn't know anybody that died from COVID, but I know people that died, like family members from people that I know, and so I know it hit people the hardest who had like respiratory issues, or that were old, or like children. I think something like that. But basically for everybody that was like middle age, or just adults or teenagers or something, I think it didn't really do much to us, thankfully. But um, I do gotta say, I think it's interesting to look back on it now, reflect after 4 years, and people bring it up once in a while. I've brought it up once in a while. Like since the pandemic, um, before the pandemic, right? Like it's a criteria point from like now that we say, right? Like there's a before the pandemic and there's an after the pandemic, right? Like I was mentioning, I remember that we would go from like red light to yellow light, and then we thought we were going to green light, but then we would go back to red light. There were moments like that when people just wanted things to go back to the way they were, and then the restrictions and the limitations just got tougher, again, and everybody was like, oh crap, 2021 came around, and it was still like, can we go back to the way things were? By then it had been like almost a year. People were tired of being at home, and things just and people just wanted things to go back to the way they were. Personally, I gotta say that I feel like maybe I could have done more. Um, if it would have, if it would, if it wouldn't have been for the pandemic, right? Because I was kind of like scaling up in the city. People were moving, and I think things were going good. But I think also the pandemic slowed everything down, and it didn't only slow everything down; it also slowed people down. I think people are now, or at least in my perspective, people are now lazier. People are now more irresponsible. People, if you used to think people didn't care before the pandemic, I think now there are more people that don't care about anything, about doing their job, about, you know it's kind of like we went through this time where um, we basically had to not care, because there was an external force of nature, like this virus, and we had to not care, because what else were we gonna do? We couldn't like do responsibilities like go to work, or socialize with friends or whatever. So now I think it's like that kind of did something to us. I'm still not sure. I haven't read any psychologist or any psychological analysis on the pandemic or how it affected people. I know there's a generation of like kindergartners that grew up like that with the pandemic, like basically being homeschooled. I think everybody has seen the videos and the pictures of these kids going back or going to class for the first time, with face masks, with this thing, with like plastic barriers between themselves and their classmates. I don't know what the effects of doing that are, and then add the technological effect of people distancing from each other, like physically and in communication terms, thanks to technology. And maybe you just have a lot of distance, right? And that was ironically like the phrase, right? Like social distancing, like 6 feet apart. You have to stay away from people because you could get sick. So how are we after all that, right? Um, yeah, and that's basically so. As a conclusion, what have we learned? Um, what have we learned, or how have we changed in these 4 years? Because I think 4 years. I mean, you study a career 4 years, and I think that's more or less the time that you need to be somewhere to consider yourself like mature in that. Um, like for example, if you're at a job, if you start working at a job your first year, your second year, you're not gonna really know what's going on, but then you'll get the hang of it like third year. By the fourth year, you know what's up. You know how everything works, right? So after the fourth year, you're mature, right? So 4 years into it, um, what have we learned? How have we changed? I think, unfortunately, it has made us more, like I mentioned, more irresponsible as as humans, less caring. Because I remember there were still like political issues and problems, and there have been problems with the whole pandemic, like mask wearing or not, vaccine or not. Um, so, apart from the fact that we live in turmoil times or in very chaotic times, we also live post pandemically, irresponsibly. Um, I would say more numb or number, um, more desensitized or like kind of carefree. Um, and it could be that people are just like that, but I think to a certain effect we have kind of forgotten about the pandemic, and we're just kind of like, you know ba- I think we like, for example, we've had to remake a new life post pandemic, and we've had to redefine our lives, right? So that redefinition basically depends on you if it's good or bad, if it's beneficial for you or not. But I think that we've been given the opportunity to redefine our lives, to like reshape them, and I think we have had a lot of tools like Zoom, like a lot of barriers and limitations like taken down, and people have been able to make extensive use of technology now for real, right? Like to really see the potential in it, to connect and to communicate whatever they need to communicate. So I think that that has been a benefit for sure, ever since the pandemic has hit. um, but yeah, it could also be that it has made people maybe lazier, or just more carefree, as to like kind of asking themselves rightfully, like, when's the next pandemic gonna hit? When's the next World War III gonna hit? When's the next world war gonna be? When's the next global catastrophe that's gonna basically rock the world and change the status quo, right? So if that can happen at any moment, why do I even try? Why do I even, you know, to a certain extent, that could be, which again, that could be just always there as a human species. So then when something like this happens, we just kind of get even more pessimistic about it. But yeah, that's all I gotta say for this video. What do you think? What have you learned from these past 4 years, or how do you think society has changed in these last 4 years? What have we learned, both good and bad? Let me know what you think. Let me know your comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.